Morning, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. It really is an honor to introduce this next fireside chat that we have between Assistant to the President for Homeland Security and Counterterrorism, Tom Bossert, and to hear again from our CEO, Mark McLaughlin. In addition to being my boss, Mark is a guy that gets the need to engage and partner with the federal government on cybersecurity. He gets that this is a shared endeavor, as you heard from him before. And so it's a great opportunity to work for somebody who has a history in public service that he brings to the private sector. Mark's a West Point grad, a former attack helicopter pilot. He rose up through the ranks within industry. He was the CEO of VeriSign before going out to the West Coast and starting with Palo Alto Networks. Tom Bossert is someone who has risen up through the ranks in both industry and government as well. Tom brings 20 years of service in a variety of different roles, from the private sector and his work with the Atlantic Counter and Cyber Statecraft Initiative, his roles within the Bush administration and the Department of Homeland Security, the Homeland Security Council, and the National Security Council. His role now is to be the primary advisor on cybersecurity, Homeland Security, counterterrorism issues, both to the president and to coordinate those policies and the execution of those policies across the national security community within the federal government. It's a tremendous responsibility. I've worked for directly several of his predecessors. I know the gravity of what he faces every day, and we really appreciate him taking the time to be with us. We also particularly appreciate his willingness to talk not just about the tactical, about the day-to-day, which it is very easy to get mired in such an all-encompassing role, but to talk about some big think issues. So we've heard from Chairman Ratcliffe and from Mark about this moonshot idea. You're going to hear more now between Mark and Tom to flesh that out a little bit, to get into the concrete nature of what are those work streams, what's the vision, and how does the public-private sector work together truly to make this a reality. So with that, I'd like to bring up Mark McLaughlin and Tom Bossert.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Good to see you again. Welcome, Tom. We really appreciate you taking the time to be with us here. I know
Thank you.
Super busy is an understatement.
This is a whirlwind as I walk in the back door and now come see you on stage, your smiling faces.
Great. I'm sure a lot of folks that you know. So, we were going to chat about a number of things, but I wanted to just give you a little bit of recap from the morning, and then maybe we can start from that, which was the idea in cyber that while lots of things have to be done every day of the week by actually a lot of people in this room and all over DC and in industry and private sector, can we get sort of an organizing principle above that? I know you and I have had the chance to speak earlier about the idea of catalyzing at the national leadership level something around what we've called other people as well have called the moonshot, which is, is it crazy to think about having an idea called "Let's make the internet safe in 10 years," and could we do that? And let me just start with that because I got a lot of questions behind that for you. But I know we debated that a little bit on the phone.
Yeah. So I think the first order of business is to say thank you for this, and thank you for what you do in particular at Palo Alto. I think what we're all grappling for isn't just the ends, but the means, and we can't figure out how to get them together. And so as I was driving over, I thought to myself, what is it we're trying to protect? Because we often talk about networked technology, and that is important, but it's really data. And so I'll offer this as a means to start the conversation. I saw a headline recently in The Economist, so this is my source, that caught me, and it was that data is the new oil. Mm-hmm. In other words, the most valuable commodity on the face of the earth now is no longer oil. At least by valuation, it's data. And the top 5 by value companies, listed companies, are all data companies. Apple, Alphabet, which is Google's parent, Amazon, and those 5, Microsoft, those 5 companies racked up $25 billion in the first quarter of this year. Mm-hmm. And those 5 companies account for more than half of all online sales. Amazon alone accounts for half of all online sales. And the data they possess and the data they protect ends up being the most costly, high value, having nothing to do with their hardware and software, crown jewel. Mm-hmm. And so if we're going to think about a moonshot, I think what we have to do is convince the society that we live in that data has a value. That thing they don't see, it's not tangible, it's not sticky, it doesn't burn. They can't put it in a barrel. But what they can do is understand that it's now more valuable and now more concentrated in the top 5 companies than any other product since Standard Oil.
So, okay, so if you're, what's the view then from the government on that? Is that good or bad?
So my view is that anybody that gets involved in this, like yourself, like most of this audience, they start to understand a better informed risk tolerance position. But what we do is we run into a greater public who has a different and lesser understood or lesser informed risk tolerance perspective. It's not wrong. And so the government's perspective is, and I find this to be interesting as I left it, came back into it, is to have our hair on fire. And we can't understand why the whole world's not more panicked about how easily their data and their networks are being penetrated on a regular basis. Mm-hmm. And then I leave and I go out into private industry and I deal with some of the clients that you have, and I find that they have a much more normalized, rational view. They pay for, they buy down, they transfer risk, and they move on. And if they can't do those things, they pass the cost along to their customers, and if they can't do that, they're not in business and they move and find a different industry. So they don't have the same panic, right? And so I think it's because government feels a sense of responsibility. And I think we should feel that sense of responsibility. I think now the question should become, how do we impose our view of our responsibility onto the society at large that we represent? I think that's maybe the wrong way of looking at it. How do we help, not impose? Mm-hmm. And as a result, any moonshot conversation has been doomed to fail in the past, because by comparison, those good leaders that have known it was time for a moonshot have picked up on the kind of zeitgeist of movement in the society, and they've said, boy, for 4 years now, our society's been really worried, thought Kennedy, about Sputnik, right? And the level of panic now is something that is going to cause the American people to understand that we want to get into that race. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure if we're there yet, and so I think our first responsibility together, public and private, is to see if there's an appetite for a call to action.
Mm-hmm. Do you feel that building up? Do you think we're getting close to that, or is it going to take some unfortunate major incident that affects, more than just the next breach of personal data, which is very important and painful, but maybe not getting the same kind of attention?
The introduction made clear, I think, that my job is all about downside risk management. And so for whatever reason, my portfolio over the years has become, and the job I occupy has become this kind of guaranteed downside risk management job. And I took the job knowing that, and I took it for one reason. The answer to your question is yes, I think they're ready. If we wait until the big event that causes the obvious catalyst, then I'll be out of a job, I'm sure. And that's fine, I'll take that risk. But if I can exercise some leadership, and this president seems very willing to exercise the leadership necessary to do things that are outside the norm, whatever you think of President Trump, I find what he's doing to be absolutely unencumbered by the traditional restraints of small petty politics. He is willing on a daily basis for me to come in and suggest something innovative. And when other advisors say, but that might be viewed negatively, or you might end up garnering an enemy of that, it doesn't tend to faze him. He's not there for some future office. He doesn't seem to be there for any future gain of any kind whatsoever. So if it's right in his view, do it. And if it's not, don't. And if somebody wants to criticize it, then go out and get into a fight with them. And so it's an opportunity for those of us in the innovative field to go out and see if we can mobilize some national effort. And so I take it as a responsibility to advise him, but I also take it as a little bit of an opportunity to speak at events like this, to come out and see if I can get you excited about it. So I'll change my monotone here, and I'll get you excited at the end.
Okay, looking forward to it. What is it that, from a cyber perspective then, in your view of the administration, and you're helping form this, if we look back after post-Trump administration, that you want to be best remembered of, not for yourself, but as the administration, of what happened in cyber that was actually meaningful and important?
Well, I guess the ideal would be the elusive vision. So I read through some of the materials in preparing for this, and there's 2 halves to any moonshot analysis that you've performed. Mm-hmm. And I want to thank you for that, by the way, and thank you for the NSTAC leadership. But the first is, measurable ends, and that's great. But the other is a vision. I don't think we have a collective vision. In fact, I'd like to get this room to wrap their head around what it is we're trying to do, because the term cybersecurity itself is elusive. So it's about, you'll hear me talk about cyber risk management. But if we would like to establish a 10-year goal, as you've set forth, of a secure internet, I'm not sure if it's achievable. So the question is, do we want it to be secure, more secure? Do we want to have an ability to manage our risk? Or do we just simply want to have an understanding of what risk we face so that we can choose our own tolerance? So if we come out with a unifying vision, I'd be thrilled. If we come out with a way to actually achieve it in 4 years, I'd be astonished.
Yeah, I agree with that. That's why we said 10, but.
Yeah. So you ask what I'd like the Trump administration to be remembered for. I'll assume we're 4, maybe 8 years. But I'll tell you what I don't want to do, had I had the vision last time around in government when we put out the cybersecurity strategy that we put out. I thought it was great. If you'd have told me that 10 years later I'd come back into government, it would still be the extant strategy and it wasn't fully implemented yet, I'd have thought, well, you'd have deemed me a failure. And I now have to kind of moderate my language on that. A lot of hard work went into it, but it didn't set a metric of 10-year existence.
Mm-hmm.
All right? What it did is it set a metric of assuming a 3 or 4 year existence, and we didn't think through. So you tell me where we are in 10 years, but there's going to be blockchain debates that in 10 years look a lot different than they do today. And there's going to be encryption debates that look different.
Yeah, as you think about technically, if you projected, 5 years, 7 years, 10 years, is there a couple, 2, 3 technical things out there like quantum or blockchain or things along those lines you think would be really meaningful for?
Yeah, so there's the futures analysis, right? And I think maybe the best way to galvanize this crowd, maybe not the man on the street, but I think the best way to galvanize us is to think about the potential for what failure looks like. I think the futures analysis on failure looks like us losing this kind of race. There's an arms race kind of underpinning to the moonshot terminology. If we lose, or if we find ourselves so far behind that we had to do something in haste, I believe that we might end up tempted, regardless of our party in power, we might end up being tempted to adopt the Chinese model, excluding and developing barriers to entry, looking at code, providing an extremely parental approach, excluding private industry's innovation, and creating that kind of great firewall of China that's around their country. And I think that ends up fracturing the internet, running afoul of our open and free kind of aspirations, and putting the government in a position that the regular American doesn't want now, and that is for the government to be in a distrusted strength position. So a position of strength where they don't trust the government now might end up being magnified and adopted in haste if we don't come up with something innovative.
Yeah,
So, and then on the technological side, it's really, does blockchain create a fundamental left turn here for us? And does the encryption breakthrough of quantum, really manifest itself? 10 years seems like a little premature for that, but.
Okay, interesting. Yeah. So how do you, you just said something that's interesting is how do you see government threading the role in cyber, unlike, say, like Moonshot, Sputnik Catalyst, or Manhattan Project Catalyst, where whenever something really bad happens in cyber, right, these breaches, particularly if they're either for sure or possibly attributed to nation states, it would seem like the populace looks to the government and says, that's at a minimum, that's a law enforcement problem, or perhaps even something at DOD or somebody. You're the government, you should be taking care of that.
Right.
But at the same time, there's actually not, from the data perspective, if you want to go back to that angle, not a lot that can be done specifically by the entity called the government. How do you thread that needle?
I don't trust lawyers, and I don't like big government. And here I'm a lawyer working for the largest government in the world. Some self-loathing. How do you thread that needle? Precise language. I hate that answer, but it's true. We talk about the cyber threat. Well, is that the malware? We often focus on the malware. Or is that the keyboard actuator, right? It's the person that created it, or the people. And so some precision here. I think the day after, people on CNN, right, are going to say, why didn't the government prevent this? Well, that's a different subset of your question. The prevention question has to do often with people, but it also has to do with technological defenses. And so the whole idea of the moonshot should be for us to, as has now become kind of mundane in this conversation, increase the likelihood of defense and reduce the strength position of the offense. The hacker right now has us in a bad position. So here's the difference. Law enforcement and government often have the ability, as you guys have heard, to shoot the archer, right? So we can go after the keyboard actuator, and we should. But in this particular case, I think cyber is a shared responsibility. If we could find a way, if you could have, you'd have already monetized it and profited from it, I think. If you could find a way to centralize and collectivize our defense, our digital defenses, we'd have done it. Every company would do it. Every large company that's international would do it, and then we as a government could adopt that same successful model and collectivize and protect everybody in our country. The Israelis have tried, but it only has a certain level of success. The British have tried, so I think we should at least catch up to where the Israelis and the British have tailored their defenses to be better than ours are currently today. But from a digital perspective, there's going to be some limitations if we adopt a wholly collectivized and centralized approach.
So maybe just, not everybody may be familiar with when you reference the UK or Israel as to
Sure.
what did they do, right?
Yeah, so, I mean, the Israelis have a different view towards their government, right, because of the neighborhood in which they live. And I like how they describe it because from a physical perspective, they live in a bad neighborhood. There are a lot of people, a lot of countries surrounding them that dislike them in their existence. And so they've adopted a reliance on their government's collective defense, and they have a conscription model that every young Israeli man gets into their military to join the fight. From a cyber perspective, they've translated that trust of government into their collective digital defense. And so it's kind of a virtual Iron Dome, if you will. Now, that works because they have a small country and they have a lot of trust, and they don't have all the privacy concerns baked into their society. And they don't have a history of abusing their people through a government that tends to seek more power. Theirs doesn't. So in this particular case, they've achieved some success. But from a cyber perspective, I think they have another good point. There is no such thing as a good neighborhood on the internet. We're all equally close to the worst actor sitting right here as they are by analogy to the physical enemies that they confront in the Middle East. And so the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, all the advanced persistent threats that we're aware of attacking US networks, whether they're private or public, might as well be in New Jersey or might as well be in Virginia here. They're next door, virtually speaking. And so what we'd like to do is adopt a little bit of that collective, at least baseline defense model that the Israelis have adopted. But I don't think that we have even the ability to scope large enough with the size of our country and our sensibilities to adopt it fully. So what the British did is recognizing something similar. They tailored it back and they said, let's at least involve the government in some of its more aggressive covert authorities and also its collective capabilities to protect the really important critical infrastructure sectors. And I think that's what we ought to explore doing as a nation, so that your top 5 customers might not want to adopt or opt into any government protection. But the operator that operates a chemical plant that's pretty important, or a water facility that's pretty important, or the biggest bank, they might want to get in, and they might want to benefit from their own defenses, your sold services, but also government protection.
Mm-hmm. How about on the manpower side? So, if we were speaking of the adversaries, particularly nation states, some have really brought to bear the education system, the militaries, the things that are organized in society, sometimes for the wrong purposes, right? So have you thoughts on what we can do to, whether it's at the education level or some of the other organizations that we already have, to bring them to bear in a way from a cyber perspective to help blunt that?
I went through my cards here to get my number right. The Department of Labor, I mean, this is the number. They say we're short over 300,000 cybersecurity workers. You can pick a different statistic if you want, but the number is pretty staggering. And by short, I'm not talking about a fungible issue here where we need to move one employee to another place that's more important. I'm saying that there are currently open jobs that are higher than the average wage for other comparable positions that are just unfilled, where there are companies that say if there was an employee anywhere in this country, we would give them more money than they would get otherwise in their educational bracket, and they're not there. They're not materializing. And so I think that part of this moonshot idea does have some merit, quite a bit of merit, because it'll allow us to bring together things that are outside the traditional profit motive.
Yeah.
So you can offer right now a lot more money, and the market would indicate, or at least my theory of the market would indicate, that you'd end up with people running towards you and taking that job. Problem is there's such a tail to their education that it's going to take you 20 years to fill that spot.
Yeah. Is there anything government can do about that?
I think the government should do a lot. I think that we should explore opportunities to push grant money and to push incentivized packages and internships and those types of things. I think maybe we even think a little bit bigger at taking maybe an Israeli or a British model. I was a part of a number of cyber startups. And one of the questions, and you've probably seen this as well, one of the questions that we asked, it's a fundamental question I've heard across the board, where do we want to base? The question isn't do we want to base in one of the 50 states. The question is, do we want to base near the NSA, or do you want to base out near the Valley, in Silicon Valley? And it's, do we want to compete for employees there or compete for employees out of the government that we're going to drain out? And I think maybe it's time for us to recognize that a co-location, or at least a collaborative effort between those two is ripe. The government right now puts a lot of time and money into training really talented cybersecurity experts, whether they're hackers or whether they're just IT security professionals or whether they're engineers. And then we give them a year or 2 or 3 of great experience. We read them into the world's biggest problems. We give them security clearances so they understand things holistically, and then they become commodities that the private industry comes and pays double and tracks away. You've probably done that. I think you
Couple
took
times, yeah.
2 of my staffers.
Right there. They miss you.
Not the paycheck, I'm sure. But the idea here is let's embrace that. Right? Right now, we know that we're getting drained out of the government, and we know that you need more. So why don't we do something collaborative? I'll throw this out there. I'm not arguing for conscription for any camera that might be on me. That's not the case, but here's an interesting observation if you don't know it. In Israel, they do have a conscription service, and so if you're 18 years old and you're a male, you're going into the military. And what they did is they said, you know, if you're 16 and you show an aptitude in high school for STEM, you know, for science or engineering, math, they allow the parents, it's often the mom apparently, to opt into a different track. And so you can take your young man, your 16-year-old son, and say, hey, this smart young man shouldn't end up carrying a rifle in the infantry and being in harm's way. What you should do is put him behind a keyboard somewhere, right? And so I don't know if it's a parental instinct or if it's just a desire for them to be rich later, probably both. They have a high number, they didn't even predict how high a rate of parents trying to opt into this. So by the time they sign up for the military, they've got a lot of people clamoring to get into the cyber side of their military. And so as a result, they train a lot, they train the best, and then they knowingly and in a co-located, positively designed system, funnel those folks out into private industry. And I'm sure some of your companies here, the people represented in this room, are taking advantage of that. And so there's no reason why we should have them developing a system like that and having all our US companies going over there to hire their best and brightest, when we could do something similar here and you could hire our best and brightest. I think that's part of the president's America First agenda, and that's something that we could do out of a federal galvanized effort.
Do you see that? It's a really interesting topic. I thought about it a lot and seen different models as well, including the Israeli model. But it seems like part of the problem with that in the United States is how do you get out of the, you've done this, but how do you get out of the government and go back as a non-political appointee and not lose your space, if you will, right? Either out of the military and come back or whatever it is. And that doesn't seem possible yet, but that would be a giant barrier to letting people go back and forth. You know?
Yeah, I'm insane. I think the answer is you do it by design. I know the answer is you do it by design. So I'll give you the answer. We need to have a professional development system in this country that applies to a broader national security portfolio that recognizes an integration of non-traditional missions. And so right now in the intelligence community, you're rewarded in terms of your career promotion if you demonstrate operational experience among and between different operations, especially among and between different departments or agencies with different missions, and then add to it or augment your resume with training and education. So this is the Goldwater-Nichols approach that created a disparate military with 4 competing branches and turned it into the best well-functioning military in the world. The idea at the time was to create a better class of flag officers. And so if you had competing younger officers seeking one day to get their flag promotion, what you do is you say, well, you have to get educated. You educate to innovate. You have to get trained. You train to replicate. And then you have to end up with joint service, this purple suited requirement. So you don't just work with the Army your whole life. If you're in the Army, get some joint operational experience where you work with the Navy, Air Force, Marines, and Coast Guard. That makes a well-rounded military man or woman that's eligible for promotion. What we ended up discovering is that we didn't create a better class of generals and admirals. What we created was a better feeder pool down the pyramid of highly educated, well-trained, well-experienced, well-rounded candidates that never did make it to that general admiral, just because there's a natural cut as you approach the top of the pyramid. And so now, if you're a retiring lieutenant colonel or colonel, you are among the best and brightest in the world. And you're going to go out and succeed whether you made that flag promotion or not. And so think about the scope of that experience. It stayed within the military. The intelligence community has the same thing. You can bounce around between the CIA and other elements of the DNI's purview, NSA and so forth, and end up with that kind of promotional experience, and you're well-rounded within the field of intelligence. What I'd like to do is start suggesting that either we develop a cybersecurity professional development effort, or we broaden the whole thing in a way that allows us to recognize and reward, both in private and public contexts, people that have had both experiences, as opposed to punishing them. So if one of my employees wants to leave and go work for you for 2 or 3 years, I should hire them back at a raise in a higher level, with more responsibilities, and recognize that they've benefited from that experience, as opposed to making them come back in and say, well, your last government experience was at GS-13, and now you're back to a GS-14. And I think that there's a natural desire for you to do that already. You're already paying people more to leave that have the right experiences. So there should be no impediment to this. But for occasionally we run into the federal union, the federal government union, and I think we can work with them on that. I actually don't think this will be a bone of contention. They're just going to have their questions answered.
Yeah, I think that would be huge.
Yeah.
If it is. You know, it reminded me of an NSTAC study we did a little while ago, I think you're familiar with, on the idea of threading the needle back to the government's role and private role, and who's got the data and the equipment, things along those lines, about mobilizing cyber assets, people and technologies, if you really needed them, like from a government perspective, right? And some of the infrastructure that's been out there but really not utilized, like the National Guard, for example, of where you might have trained cyber experts already, but also the idea of the government being able to have some directive control over assets if you absolutely positively had to have them. But one of the outcomes of that, the whole study, was the idea of whether we needed to actually have something like the merchant marine, if you will, you know, sort of as an analogy, where people are in tracks, they have rank, you know, they spend weekends and things along those lines. I don't know if you've seen any thought or progress on that as you're kind of talking. What you just said sounds kind of like that, but I'm not sure how organized, you know. I
would love an organized effort, but I would caution against the overly prescriptive first round of implementation of the Goldwater-Nichols experience that I just mentioned. I didn't go through it, but I can tell you those that I talked to will tell you that the extremely prescriptive nature of what did and did not qualify as your joint operational experience ended up leaving a lot of people out of consideration. And so you could come to the White House and work for 2 years and not be recognized as a joint operational experience. And you could have a number of other training opportunities that didn't quite meet what was in the track and not get credit for it. As a result, a more flexible system would have been a better one. And so that experience should translate into what we build. Whatever we build together should allow us to kind of mobilize around one particularly acute situation, but it shouldn't be driven by that. It should be driven by the problem that we see, and the problem we see is a trend line going in the wrong direction. If you haven't been reading the newspapers in cybersecurity, you know, you don't have to, right? You can be the kind of guy that just reads the occasional chyron as you walk by a TV screen and see cyber in the news every other week, and it affects, you know, your mom and dad and your cousin or uncle that don't pay attention to cyber at all because they call you as they called me and say, "Did you see this Equifax thing?" Yes, Dad.
What'd you do about it? No. You're the government.
Yeah. What are you doing about it? Well, nothing. Nothing. So, why not? Aren't you the government? That conversation happened. So I think that if our society is going to start making that phone call, then we ought to be prepared to answer it. But for right now, every time we propose the government getting involved, and let's talk about that. Let's shift into how the government might get involved. People panic. And at least from my perspective, let's take your company, for an example. The firewall services that you offer are par excellence, bar none, great, right?
Thank you for that, yes.
But they're not sufficient to block everything,
That's true,
and you don't warrant them as such.
we don't.
But if you were able to push those walls out, let's call it higher into the topography of the internet, they'd be more effective. Any effort here, any study of our history of pushing any border out or any defenses out further into enemy territory and away from that which you're protecting. So if data is the oil in this case, you want to protect that oil not 5 feet around the pipeline, but 500 feet or 5 miles or 500 miles if possible. And so you want to build some kind of layered defense, but you want to push it out into the topography. Well, pushing out a firewall into the topography at this point would mean into the internet service provider lane. And any conversation about pushing defensive services, at least government-born ones, into the internet service provider world garners a whole lot of concern. Justifiable questions, but a whole lot of immediate negative reaction. People's body language changes and they go like this. You'll never get that. Why not? Well, I don't know. It's not me that opposes it, but somebody will oppose it. And what they'll say is the government's going to read my email, or the government's going to read my email and then throw me in jail, take away my life or my liberty. They're going to tax me. They're going to find some loophole. They're going to find some way to sway my vote. Or they say, I don't like it because it's going to slow my service, or it's going to get into some net neutrality argument, or it's going to require some regulatory schema that makes the internet service providers all bad. So get out of the way, and innovation will lead the way. I agree with all those concerns, but if you're not going to block everything with your model, and you'd be a better model and a better service provider if you could push that out.
Yeah, we actually agree. One of the things that we were talking about this morning was the of having everything be data-driven models where you take applications and plug them into the data and everybody can do their best work innovatively against a data set as opposed to trying to do everything, specifically. So I think that has to happen, right? For things to really work. And there's definitely good questions about who gets to see the data and all the things you raised.
Not only who gets to see the data, but what you do with it. Right?
Exactly.
So if we gave you the great, perfect knowledge that you needed and you could push out into the topography of the internet, you might be able to improve your defenses. But that would be the wrong way to go, to just block the bad guy. I mean, change your mindset here from all the analogies you've heard before out of law enforcement. Yeah, we have to go after the bad guy, the malefactor, whether it's a criminal or a nation state. But you've got a guy with wire cutters at the fence. This is a cyber world. We don't have to necessarily stop him. You can, with ones and zeros, take away his wire cutters. He doesn't even know what they turned into. He doesn't understand how it happened, or he doesn't understand why he's frustrated. The government might need to go after that guy or girl and punish them in some way that creates a deterrent in the future. I think we do. But by the way, we don't have to do that online. There's a whole lot of kinetic options, there's a whole lot of trade options, there's a whole lot of other tools in the toolkit for governments to go after the archer. But for the innovators like you, that we should start mobilizing and galvanizing around a new way of looking at things. You can stop, block, tip, queue, shadow, honeypot. You can do anything, whatever terminology you want to use, to the bad guy to confuse them and to buy a little bit of restored balance, right? So we're in an imbalance with the offense having the advantage over the defense. I think we can buy back some restored balance there.
Yep. So go back to Moonshot for a second. Of one of the main barriers, perhaps, to anything super meaningful would be the state of the supply chain. So you ask your thoughts on that, which what I mean by that is the componentry aspects of everything that's in our digital world today being very far, from our control in the sense of manufacturing base. Is that genie so far out of the bottle it can't be brought back? Or how do you think about that from a government perspective?
Yeah, no, I guess maybe a pivot there would be that the theorists tend to drive the practitioners nuts in this space, at least in my experience. And so what I just mentioned a moment ago wasn't pure theory. In fact, it's the opposite. What I mentioned a moment ago was a way of looking at this that would allow the practitioners some space to maneuver. For those people that sit up here or sit on a panel and say, well, hygiene's all you need to focus on. Well, I think they ignore the realities of practitioners. The small business that owns a payroll system that operates on XP, PAC3 or something. Right? They just can't afford to change it, or it's just not practical for them to. So this is bigger than Patch Tuesdays, if you will. Right, but the theorists and the practitioners have to come together in a way that makes sense. So when I look at supply chain, I tread lightly. When I look at who controls chipset manufacturing, I think the government's got a role there. I think that we're crazy to think that we should operate in a completely free market, open market environment where all the other players operate in a way that don't abide by the rules, where there's other nation states subsidizing the manufacturing of high-cost components, and we're sitting around saying, well, the market should be able to compete with that. That's a very difficult place for our American companies to operate, and I think that we should take some very practical steps to prohibit those kind of unfair trade practices with some directly competing U.S. muscle. And I think you'll see President Trump espouse that as part of his economic view. And when he says fair and reciprocal trade, he's not rejecting free trade as a concept. He's just acknowledging the practical reality of everyone else not playing fair. And so if everyone else isn't playing fair, then we need to push back a little bit and create the space for you American innovators or American-based innovators to play on that space, on that level playing field. When you're talking about the smaller level of practitioner supply chain, and you end up, for those of you that remember Dale Myros, he spent a lot of money trying to crack open a lot of keyboards and look for spiders and so forth. That's becoming increasingly difficult for us to control, increasingly difficult for any government effort to motivate around. And I think it's going to require private effort.
Do you see the U.S. government playing a role in trying to, I'll call it, push down security at some level into small businesses? We've seen this being discussed in other countries where you say it's big companies may have the resources, government may have the resources, whether they all utilize them correctly or not. But when you really get downstream, and those folks are suppliers to people upstream, it starts to fall apart, even before you get to consumers.
Yeah.
So just, do you see the U.S. government having a role in small businesses and trying to do something?
Small businesses are the biggest problem. They are the biggest victim in this whole conversation because Citibank can afford to put more money into things than Exxon. The government's got purchasing power. The small business is forced to use the internet, right? Because it's their lifeblood. And they're forced to use things that are, by almost definition, the most vulnerable. Now, the good news is they're not always the target. So I don't think the government will force them, but I do think that we should start providing an opportunity for them to opt into protective services that don't cost them so much money as to make their business model untenable. And so as long as we all agree that the internet's not a right, but that it is something that we're all going to collectively use for the betterment of our society, then let's protect it in ways that are not dissimilar to the way we protect individuals in neighborhoods and societies. A shared responsibility, government has a role, and we can share some taxpayer dollars to provide a baseline level of security for all, not just the rich or the poor.
You know, on the tax side, we talked about this on the phone a few weeks ago as well, but an idea that's been tossed around was in the guise, or not the guise, but under the umbrella of infrastructure, right? And cyber, if you consider it as part of infrastructure for the U.S., just like bridges and other things. Is there an opportunity, you think, with if we get tax reform done, to use some of the repatriation dollars from that into cyber programs like that one, or education, or any other things we just talked about?
Absolutely, right? You know, if you make more revenue, you have more money to spend. I mean, government proves that mantra. But I think that there's other things that are more structural that could come from improved tax policy. So you'll get me outside my lane here pretty quickly. But you know, if we achieve what I understand to be the rudiment tenements of President Trump's tax cuts and reform, right? Both are important. We're going to end up with a lower baseline tax bracket for all, and the repatriation will be, I think, the first of a 2 or 3 step improvement to our economy. We've already seen Foxconn agree to bring manufacturing capabilities and open plants here in the United States. They're the manufacturer behind Apple's iPhones and iPads. Them moving those jobs here are largely decisions based out of trust and personal relationships. They trust this administration and their personal relationships to create the environment and conditions for them to move their businesses here, and the state government, I think, in Wisconsin, to provide the incentives necessary for the short term. But if we can't maintain some reformed federal tax code, they're going to leave again at some point. And all the other manufacturers that have subsidiary jobs in this tech industry are going to stay overseas. And by the way, China operates in a world in which they apply a different worldview. And they're insisting on seeing your code before and as a barrier to entry to you entering into their market. Great, if you want to show your source code to them, and if that were the only decision and it were only to affect you, then that's your decision. But if you're going to do that and show your source code to them as a precondition to entering into their market, you're now making every one of your other customers vulnerable to the Chinese government's knowledge, because they can exploit your customers. And so there's a collective decision making here that does bear a government role, but it does also merit attracting those types of companies to the United States. So the more we've got manufacturers and technology companies here where we don't get into your business and read your code and expose it to enemies, the better.
Yep. Maybe going back to where we started for a second, though, I'd be interested in your views. With the aggregation of data in more and more concentrated kind of areas, do you see and trust being so important, as you just said, right? Do you see the trust factor going up or down relative to the government and industry view, or industry, I should say, particularly some of these larger players from data sources? Is it getting better or worse?
Yeah, I think both at the same time, right? I think that I'm seeing anecdotally a continued, at least on the representative side of government, a continuing distrust in any organization at any level. Any institution seems to be distrusted in our society right now, which is frustrating if you feel like you deserve to be trusted and you're working in an institution. But it's understandable when you look at it from the outside, especially when you every once in a while see a colleague and say, holy cow, what are you advocating? You don't understand cybersecurity enough to advocate that we should offensively hack someone. You have to make sure that they understand what they're advocating is wrong and that we shouldn't behave that way because we wouldn't tolerate others behaving that way. But I think that at the same time I say that, society seems to be becoming increasingly numb to the news that their data is lost out of private cloud services and out of private network managers and by private service providers. And they're getting to the point where they start to just build it into their cost of doing business. So I think that there's a large distrust across the board. And so my ideal outcome here would be to inspire some more trust in government. I'm going to try to do that here. But if I can't, at very least, the trend seems to be to have us all in the same swamp together. And people are starting to realize that digitally connected technology and the internet itself is an open medium that does not lend itself to security. And so without some willingness to try something new and significant, we're going to end up at a kind of bad alternate future outcome.
Yep.
And so let's either try something different together or wake up one day where we have to, again, be repetitive, in haste, adopt a model that our bad guy enemies have adopted and that we don't look to aspire to, but we'll have no choice but to adopt. I think that'd be a shame if we did it.
Yeah. Last couple of minutes, is there anything that you'd like to ask this audience to help you with on your initiatives that you'd like to see us do?
Yeah, I mean, look, this audience can probably write the strategy for me. So I'd like you to do that. And I mean that because let me give a plug to you here as there's some crossover, maybe some homework for you. Upcoming, we have the expiration of one of our surveillance authorities. The government, it's 702. It's section 702 of a statute, so we always refer to it as our 702 surveillance authority. But it's the recognition that the government and the Congress, executive branch, and the legislative branch reached about 10 years ago that when we collect foreign intelligence, we used to do it with the old-fashioned telephone system. And the law was written in such a way that you could distinguish a foreign phone system making foreign phone calls, and so there was no reason to think that you'd end up collecting on an American citizen or U.S. person. When we realized that there were bad guy terrorists talking to bad guy terrorists in foreign lands in two foreign places that happened to use Gmail, we realized we had a different problem to solve. And we created this new authority that allowed us to collect that foreign intelligence on foreign people, but with the help and protection of Google, or with the help and protection of Apple or the other service provider, the internet service provider here in the United States. It's still a successful model. We use it well, and it helps break down the barriers that we had seen before 9/11 to finding terrorist attacks and trying to prevent them or prosecute them or both. It expires soon. So the administration and Democrats, Republicans, hard left, hard right, anybody that's been in this field before believes it's a good authority to reauthorize. So it's a good bellwether test to see if those people that are so distrustful have the clout to come in and disrupt the reauthorization of what seems to be a good and stable and safe and well-protected program. But the second test, and this is for you guys to think through, I believe we're going to be real honest with you, and I'm close enough to know. I have a great deal of confidence that Congress is going to reauthorize that program with a modicum of maybe changes that won't affect the effectiveness of the program, but that will protect American citizens. What I want you to do is think through where we are in 5 or 10 years in our ability to distinguish and the rationale of even trying to distinguish foreign data from domestic data, foreign servers from domestic servers, as information flows the fastest route around the globe. It's going to become increasingly difficult for us to separate all of these functions. And right now, one of the difficulties is to understand how any IP address could be readily addressable to a US person or any other person. Without getting into some deep dive investigation, you would have no idea who that IP address belonged to and what their nationality or citizenship was. So what we want to do is think through a future world in which we want to have an open internet and a secure one. And my challenge to you would be, how do I couch that vision? Is it about data and the concepts of property, which I believe it to be? Mm-hmm. Or is it about something bigger and nationalistic, which I don't think it has to be. But if it becomes that latter, nationalistic, bigger debate, and we're in a fight, then we're in a different environment. And so I'll end with this thought. I think that the call to a moonshot, we go to the moon speech from Kennedy's perspective doesn't quite apply here. So I like the moonshot idea, but we were in a space race, whether we liked it or not, with one adversary. Mm-hmm. And the solution was to collectivize all our resources to win that race. It's pretty simple. He had the leadership and the gift for gab and the sense of timing necessary to make that happen. But in this particular case, we don't have one adversary. We have a fundamentally unsafe medium, and we've got adversaries everywhere. And we have to also decide how we want to comport our own behavior. And so if we're all going to operate in our own self-interest and our nation's going to operate in our own national interest, then we're all going to exploit every vulnerability we find, every time we find it, for our own purposes and our own good. That is the definition of criminal chaos. And so if we're going to impose a grand vision on the world, I'd like us to think outside of cyber, which I'm capable of talking about all day long if you'd like to talk about it. I'd like us to think about how we're going to organize our socioeconomic model and our criminal code and our civil laws, the entire way we organize ourselves around our economic and moral sense. And if we think that data is something worth protecting, and we think that there's a reason to protect it in our civil courts and our criminal courts and with our military force, then let's define that. Let's share our vision. Otherwise, we're going to end up in a Wild West where we all just hack each other, and the internet becomes an incredibly hard-to-trust environment, and any data becomes corruptible and therefore distrusted. So if we get to that outcome where we distrust the data on the internet, I think we're going to have to scrap the whole innovation.
Yeah, we agree. Mentioned earlier this morning, if we lose the trust, it's all over, right? So
if we lose the trust in the data, forget about your trust in government.
Agreed with that. Well, great. Thanks. We really appreciate that. We're going to switch gears now and talk about something that we started with a little earlier, which is dearth of talent in cybersecurity. So our next session with Congressman Gallagher and General Davis is going to be on vets in tech and how we use a resource that's out there already and how to get them more into cybersecurity. And we'll focus on some of the one of our own employees and some of the things that he's done. So watch a little video. But before we turn to that, I want to thank you, Tom, for your time and your service. We really appreciate it and your candor today.
Thanks.
Thank you.
And the next speakers have a friend in me.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay.
Appreciate your time. Thank you very much.